In the dust-covered mining camps of 1880s Colorado, where a man's word was worth more than the gold beneath his boots, one cowboy's decision to keep a promise would cost him a fortune that could have changed his life forever. But, sometimes, what we lose in gold, we gain in something far more precious. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of Cripple Creek as Jake Morrison adjusted his worn leather chaps and checked the cinch on his horse's saddle. At 28, Jake had already lived more adventure than most men twice his age. His weathered hands told stories of countless days working cattle drives across the harsh Colorado landscape, and his steady blue eyes held the kind of quiet confidence that came from facing down charging bulls and surviving blizzards that could freeze a man solid. Jake had arrived in Cripple Creek 3 months earlier, not chasing dreams of gold like most men, but following a herd of cattle that needed to reach the mining camps before winter set in. The job paid well enough, and Jake had a reputation for getting livestock through the treacherous mountain passes when other cowboys turned back. But what started as a simple cattle delivery had turned into something much more complicated. The mining camp buzzed with constant activity. Men with dirt-stained faces and hope-filled eyes worked claims from dawn until dusk, always believing the next strike would be the big one. The sound of pickaxes hitting stone echoed through the canyon, mixing with the shouts of miners and the creaking of wooden cartwheels. Jake had seen it all before in other boom towns scattered across the West. Some men struck it rich, but most went home empty-handed, their dreams buried alongside their savings in the unforgiving earth. What made Cripple Creek different for Jake wasn't the promise of gold, but the friendship he'd struck up with an unlikely partner. Thomas Chen was a Chinese immigrant who had come to America with nothing but determination and a small leather pouch containing his life savings. Unlike many of the other Chinese workers who labored in dangerous mine shafts for minimal wages, Thomas had managed to secure his own small claim through a combination of shrewd negotiation and pure persistence. The friendship between Jake and Thomas had started over a simple act of kindness. Jake had witnessed a group of drunk miners harassing Thomas outside the general store, making cruel jokes about his accent and threatening to run him out of town. Without hesitation, Jake had stepped in, his hand resting casually on his gun belt as he suggested the miners find somewhere else to spend their evening. The confrontation ended without violence, but it marked the beginning of an unlikely partnership that would change both men's lives. Thomas possessed something that Jake found refreshing in the rough mining camp, an unwavering sense of honor and dignity that reminded Jake of the cowboy code he'd grown up respecting. Despite facing daily prejudice and discrimination, Thomas never responded with anger or bitterness. Instead, he worked harder than anyone else, saved every penny he could, and treated every person he met with genuine respect, regardless of how they treated him in return. Over cups of strong coffee in Thomas's modest tent, the two men had shared stories of their very different paths to Colorado. Thomas spoke of leaving his family in China, promising his aging parents that he would return with enough money to ensure their comfort in their final years. He carried their photograph wrapped in silk, and Jake had seen him studying it by lamplight, his expression mixing determination with homesickness. Jake, in turn, had shared his own story of growing up on a small ranch in Texas, learning the value of hard work and keeping one's word from a father who believed a man's reputation was his most valuable possession. After his parents died in a fever outbreak, Jake had sold the family ranch and taken to the cowboy life, moving from job to job across the frontier, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. The partnership had formed naturally. Jake's knowledge of horses and his reputation for honest dealing had proven valuable in the mining camp, where good transportation and trustworthy suppliers were always in demand. Thomas's careful attention to detail and his ability to spot opportunities others missed complemented Jake's practical skills perfectly. They had started small, helping miners transport equipment and supplies, but their business had grown steadily as word spread about their reliability. Then came the discovery that changed everything. While helping Thomas repair a damaged section of his claim after a heavy rain, Jake had noticed something glinting in the muddy water that flowed through the makeshift drainage channel. At first, he thought it might be pyrite, the fool's gold that had disappointed countless prospectors. But, as he cleaned the small nugget with his thumb, Jake realized he was holding genuine gold, and not just a tiny flake, but a substantial piece that could be worth several $100s. The rational thing would have been to keep quiet about the discovery. Jake had found the gold on Thomas's claim, but Thomas hadn't been present when Jake spotted it. In the rough justice of the mining camps, possession often determined ownership, and Jake could have easily pocketed the nugget without anyone being the wiser. The gold could have funded his own prospecting efforts or provided the stake he needed to start a real business in one of the growing towns along the railroad. Instead, Jake had called Thomas over and placed the nugget in his friend's palm. The look of amazement and gratitude on Thomas's face had been worth more than any monetary value the gold might have possessed. But that single nugget had proven to be just the beginning. Over the following days, careful exploration of the area where Jake had made the discovery revealed clear signs of a much larger gold deposit. The technical aspects of mining were beyond both men's expertise, but Thomas had connections in the Chinese community who understood geology or extraction. Through careful inquiries, they learned that Thomas's claim likely sat above a rich vein that could potentially yield thousands of dollars worth of gold. However, extracting it would require proper equipment, experienced miners, and a significant upfront investment that neither man possessed. That's when Samuel Hartwell entered the picture. Hartwell was a successful businessman from Denver who had made his fortune supplying mining operations throughout Colorado. He dressed in expensive suits that somehow stayed clean despite the dusty conditions, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to making deals worth thousands of dollars. Hartwell had heard rumors about the potential discovery on Thomas's claim and had come to Cripple Creek specifically to investigate. The offer Hartwell presented was both generous and complicated. He was willing to purchase Thomas's claim outright for $5,000, an enormous sum that represented more money than Thomas could have earned in 20 years of hard labor. Alternatively, Hartwell was prepared to enter into a partnership arrangement where he would provide all the necessary equipment and expertise in exchange for 75% of whatever gold was extracted from the claim. For Thomas, either option represented the fulfillment of his dreams and the answer to his family's prayers back in China. $5,000 would allow him to return home as a successful man, able to provide for his parents and secure his own future. The partnership arrangement held the possibility of even greater wealth, though it also carried more risk and would require Thomas to stay in Colorado for an unknown length of time. But there was a complication that neither Thomas nor Hartwell knew about. During one of their late-night conversations, Thomas had made Jake a promise that weighed heavily on both their minds. Thomas had insisted that if his claim ever proved profitable, he would split any proceeds equally with Jake, recognizing that Jake's discovery of the initial nugget had been crucial to identifying the larger deposit. The promise had been made between friends, sealed with a handshake rather than any legal document. In the eyes of the law, Jake had no claim to Thomas's property or any gold that might be extracted from it. Thomas could have easily accepted Hartwell's offer without mentioning Jake's involvement, and no one would have been the wiser. The promise existed only in the realm of personal honor, the kind of unwritten code that governed relationships between men who valued their word above their wealth. Jake found himself in an impossible position. He genuinely wanted Thomas to accept Hartwell's offer and secure his financial future, but he also understood that honoring their agreement would significantly complicate the situation. If Thomas split the $5,000 payment equally, both men would receive $2,500, still a substantial sum but only half of what Thomas could claim for himself. More importantly, Jake worried that involving him in the deal might give Hartwell reason to question the legitimacy of Thomas's ownership or to reduce his offer. The mining camp's social dynamics added another layer of complexity to the situation. Anti-Chinese sentiment ran high among many of the white miners, and Jake had witnessed numerous instances where successful Chinese prospectors had been driven from their claims through intimidation or legal challenges. Hartwell seemed like a reasonable businessman, but Jake couldn't be sure how he would react to learning that a white cowboy claimed a share in what many would consider a Chinese man's claim. As Jake sat by his campfire that evening, watching the stars appear above the mountain peaks, he wrestled with a decision that would define not only his own future but his sense of who he was as a man. The easy path lay clearly before him. He could tell Thomas to forget their agreement and take Hartwell's full offer. Thomas would become wealthy, Jake would maintain his clear conscience, and both men could move forward with their lives. But the cowboy code that Jake's father had taught him demanded something different. A man's word was his bond, regardless of whether that bond was convenient or profitable. Honor wasn't something that could be negotiated based on circumstances, it was an absolute principle that either guided a man's actions or it didn't. The question wasn't whether Jake could live with letting Thomas break their agreement, but whether he could live with himself if he encouraged his friend to do so. The weight of the decision pressed down on Jake's shoulders as he prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring a conversation that could change everything, a moment when two friends would discover whether their bond was strong enough to withstand the temptation of gold and the complexities of honor in a world where both commodities were in short supply. The morning brought with it a crisp mountain air that carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of mining operations already beginning their daily work. Jake had slept poorly, his mind churning over the conversation he needed to have with Thomas. As he made his way to Thomas's camp, he noticed the Chinese miner was already awake, sitting cross-legged outside his tent and carefully examining a geological survey map that Hartwell had provided the previous day. Thomas looked up as Jake approached, and the smile that crossed his face was tinged with both excitement and uncertainty. In his hands, he held Hartwell's written offer, the paper that represented more money than most men in the camp would see in a lifetime. But Jake could see in his friend's eyes the same struggle that had kept him awake through the long night. The conversation that followed would become one of the most important moments in both men's lives. Thomas spoke first, his English careful and deliberate as he expressed his gratitude for Jake's friendship and his concern about their previous agreement. He understood the magnitude of Hartwell's offer and the life-changing opportunity it represented, but he also understood that honoring his promise to Jake would mean splitting the payment in half. Jake listened carefully, recognizing the internal conflict his friend was experiencing. Thomas wasn't questioning whether he should honor their agreement, he was questioning whether Jake would want him to. The Chinese miner had grown up in a culture that placed enormous emphasis on keeping one's word and maintaining face, but he had also witnessed the harsh realities of survival in the American frontier, where practical considerations sometimes had to override idealistic principles. What Jake said next surprised them both. Instead of releasing Thomas from their agreement or insisting on his share of the payment, Jake proposed a third option that neither man had previously considered. He suggested that they approach Hartwell together, presenting themselves as equal partners in the claim and negotiating from a position of shared ownership. The idea was risky, potentially jeopardizing the entire deal if Hartwell reacted poorly to the revelation, but it offered the possibility of maintaining both their friendship and their principles. Thomas's initial reaction was concern for Jake's welfare rather than his own potential profits. He understood the prejudices that existed in the mining camp and worried that associating with him might somehow damage Jake's reputation or future prospects. But Jake dismissed these concerns with the same straightforward manner that had characterized their friendship from the beginning. He pointed out that his reputation was based on his actions and his character, not on the opinions of men who judged others by the color of their skin or the country of their birth. The decision to approach Hartwell together represented more than just a business strategy, it was a declaration of the values that both men held dear. They were choosing to trust in the power of honesty and partnership over the safer path of individual self-interest. Neither man could predict how Hartwell would respond, but they were committed to facing whatever consequences arose from their decision to stand together. The meeting with Hartwell took place that afternoon in the dining room of the camp's only hotel, a rough establishment that served as the closest thing to a formal business setting the mining community could offer. Hartwell arrived promptly, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the same expensive suit he had worn during their previous encounters. His demeanor was professional but friendly, clearly expecting to finalize a straightforward transaction with Thomas. The businessman's expression shifted from confidence to confusion as Jake took a seat at the table alongside Thomas. When Thomas explained that Jake was his equal partner in the claim and that any agreement would need to include both men, Hartwell's reaction was immediate and negative. He questioned the legitimacy of Jake's claim to the property, demanded to see legal documentation of their partnership, and suggested that Thomas was being manipulated by someone seeking to take advantage of his good nature. Jake remained calm throughout Hartwell's challenges, allowing Thomas to explain the circumstances of their agreement and the role that Jake's discovery had played in identifying the gold deposit. The cowboy's steady presence and respectful manner gradually seemed to influence Hartwell's assessment of the situation. While the businessman clearly hadn't expected to negotiate with two partners, he began to recognize that their partnership was genuine rather than some sort of elaborate deception. The negotiation that followed tested both men's resolve and their friendship. Hartwell's revised offer was significantly lower than his original proposal to Thomas alone. The businessman argued that splitting ownership between two partners increased his legal risks and complicated the mining operation he had planned. His new offer was $3,000 for the claim, to be divided between Jake and Thomas, or a partnership arrangement that would give both men a 20% share of the extracted gold instead of the 25% Thomas might have received alone. The reduction in terms was substantial enough to give both men pause. Thomas would be giving up $2,000 by honoring his agreement with Jake, while Jake would be receiving $1,500 that he had no legal right to claim. The mathematics of the situation were clear, but the emotional and ethical calculations were far more complex. During a brief recess in the negotiations, Jake and Thomas walked outside to discuss their options privately. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the mining camp, and both men were acutely aware that their decision would affect not only their own futures but also the lives of Thomas's family members back in China who were depending on his success in America. Thomas surprised Jake by expressing not disappointment at the reduced offer, but gratitude for Jake's willingness to stand by their agreement. He explained that the $1,500 he would receive from the sale was still more money than he had ever possessed, and, more importantly, it came with the knowledge that he had maintained his honor and his friendship. For Thomas, these intangible benefits were worth far more than the additional money he might have received by breaking his word. Jake found himself equally moved by his friend's perspective. He had entered the negotiation prepared to walk away empty-handed if necessary to preserve Thomas's opportunity, but Thomas's insistence on honoring their partnership had resulted in both men benefiting from the arrangement. The $1,500 represented financial security that Jake had never experienced, but the deeper satisfaction came from knowing that their friendship had survived the test of significant monetary temptation. When they returned to the negotiation table, both men accepted Hartwell's revised terms without further argument. The businessman seemed surprised by their quick agreement, perhaps expecting them to push for better terms or to reconsider their partnership in light of the financial implications. But Jake and Thomas signed the papers with the same calm determination they had shown throughout the process. The legal formalities took several days to complete, during which both men continued their regular work while processing the magnitude of the change that was about to occur in their lives. For Thomas, the money represented the fulfillment of his promise to his family and the beginning of his journey back to China. For Jake, it meant the first real financial foundation he had ever possessed and the freedom to choose his next steps without the pressure of immediate economic necessity. But the most significant development during this waiting period wasn't related to the money or the legal paperwork. Word of their partnership and their decision to split Hartwell's payment had spread throughout the mining camp, generating reactions that ranged from admiration to skepticism to outright hostility. Some of the white miners questioned Jake's judgment in sharing his windfall with a Chinese partner, while some members of the Chinese community wondered whether Thomas was being foolish to trust a white cowboy with such a significant financial arrangement. These external pressures tested the strength of the bond between Jake and Thomas in ways that the original negotiation hadn't. It was one thing to make an honorable decision in private, but quite another to stand by that decision when it was being publicly questioned and criticized. Both men found themselves defending not only their own choices but also their friend's character and motivations. Jake discovered that his reputation in the camp was indeed affected by his partnership with Thomas, but not in the way he had expected. While a few miners distanced themselves from him, many others expressed respect for his willingness to honor his word even when doing so came at personal cost. The story of their partnership became a topic of conversation throughout Cripple Creek, with some viewing it as an example of the kind of integrity the frontier needed more of, while others saw it as evidence of changing times that threatened traditional social hierarchies. For Thomas, the experience was even more complex. His success in negotiating an equal partnership with a white businessman was unprecedented in his community's experience, and it raised expectations and hopes among other Chinese miners who had previously felt powerless in their dealings with white-owned businesses. Thomas found himself sought out for advice and assistance by men who viewed him as having achieved something previously thought impossible. The responsibility that came with this new role weighed heavily on Thomas's shoulders. He understood that his actions were being watched not just by his immediate community but by people throughout the region who were curious about this unusual partnership. The pressure to succeed and to demonstrate that Chinese immigrants could be trusted as equal partners in American business ventures added an additional layer of significance to every decision he made. As the final legal paperwork was completed and the payment from Hartwell was distributed, both Jake and Thomas faced the reality that their lives were about to change dramatically. The money represented freedom and opportunity, but it also marked the end of the simple friendship that had developed between a cowboy and a Chinese miner in the rough mining camp of Cripple Creek. Whatever came next would be shaped by the decision they had made to honor their word and trust in each other, even when doing so required significant personal sacrifice. The months following the sale of Thomas's claim brought changes that neither man could have anticipated when they first shook hands over their simple agreement. Thomas used his $1,500 to book passage back to China, but his departure was delayed by an unexpected opportunity that arose from his newfound reputation in the mining community. Several Chinese families in Cripple Creek approached Thomas with a proposal that would change the course of his life. They had pooled their modest savings and wanted Thomas to represent them in purchasing and developing mining claims of their own. His success in negotiating as an equal partner with Hartwell had demonstrated that Chinese immigrants could achieve business success in America when they had strong leadership and community support. The responsibility was enormous. Thomas would be trusted with the life savings of dozen families, people who had worked in dangerous conditions for minimal wages and had somehow managed to save enough money to invest in their own dreams of prosperity. The weight of their trust and expectations was almost overwhelming, but Thomas recognized that this opportunity represented something far more significant than personal wealth. He wrote to his parents in China, explaining that his return home would be delayed but that the reason for the delay offered the possibility of helping many other families achieve their own version of the American dream. His parents' response, delivered through a letter that took months to reach him, expressed pride in his success and encouragement for his decision to help others in their community. Jake, meanwhile, found himself facing his own crossroads. The $1,500 represented more money than he had ever possessed, and it offered him the freedom to choose his next steps without the immediate pressure of earning daily wages. He could have used the money to purchase his own ranch, returning to the cattle-raising life he had grown up with but on a much larger scale than his family had ever managed. Instead, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. He offered to invest his money alongside the Chinese families who had approached Thomas, becoming not just Thomas's friend but his business partner in a more formal sense. The decision wasn't driven primarily by the potential for financial gain, though the mining investments did offer that possibility. Rather, Jake was motivated by his belief in Thomas's character and his desire to be part of something that could make a real difference in people's lives. The reaction to Jake's decision was mixed throughout the mining camp. Some viewed his choice to invest with the Chinese community as a betrayal of his own race, while others saw it as evidence of the kind of progressive thinking that would be necessary for the American West to achieve its full potential. Jake found himself caught between competing visions of what the frontier should represent and what kinds of partnerships would be acceptable in the rapidly changing social landscape of Colorado. The business venture that Thomas and Jake developed together was unlike anything that had been attempted in the region before. Instead of individual miners working isolated claims and competing against each other, they created a cooperative system where multiple families shared resources, equipment, and expertise. The approach was more efficient than traditional methods and offered better protection against the kind of claim jumping and intimidation that had driven many Chinese miners away from profitable sites. The success of their cooperative venture attracted attention from beyond the mining camp. Newspaper reporters from Denver and other Colorado cities came to Cripple Creek to write about the unusual partnership between a cowboy and a Chinese immigrant that was challenging traditional assumptions about race, business, and community cooperation on the American frontier. These articles brought both positive recognition and increased scrutiny to Jake and Thomas's operation. Potential investors expressed interest in funding expansion of their cooperative model to other mining regions, while opponents organized efforts to challenge the legal validity of some of their claims. The attention transformed what had begun as a simple friendship into a symbol of larger social and economic changes sweeping through the American West. The legal challenges proved to be particularly difficult to navigate. Several white mining companies filed complaints alleging that the cooperative was engaging in unfair business practices and that foreign nationals shouldn't be allowed to control significant mining operations in American territory. The accusations were largely unfounded, but they required expensive legal representation and created uncertainty that discouraged some potential partners from joining the cooperative. Jake found himself spending more and more time dealing with lawyers and government officials, roles that were far removed from his background as a cowboy but that were necessary for protecting the business he and Thomas had built together. The experience taught him about the complex intersection of race, economics, and politics in American society, lessons that were often frustrating but that deepened his appreciation for the challenges Thomas and other immigrants faced every day. Thomas, meanwhile, was discovering that success brought its own set of complications. The cooperative's profits allowed him to send substantial amounts of money back to his family in China, fulfilling his original promise to provide for his parents' security. But success also made him a target for both legitimate business competitors and those who opposed Chinese economic advancement on principle. The threats weren't always subtle. Anonymous notes warned Thomas to leave Colorado before something unfortunate happened to him, and several attempts were made to sabotage equipment at cooperative mining sites. Jake's presence as Thomas's partner provided some protection, since attacking the operation meant attacking both a Chinese immigrant and a white cowboy, making the political implications more complicated for potential antagonists. The partnership between Jake and Thomas also began to inspire other cross-cultural business relationships throughout the region. Mexican miners began forming their own cooperatives modeled after the one Thomas and Jake had created, while some white miners who had initially been skeptical started requesting partnerships with Chinese workers who had proven expertise in specific mining techniques. These developments represented a gradual but significant shift in the social dynamics of the Colorado mining region. The strict racial hierarchies that had previously governed most business relationships were beginning to give way to more pragmatic partnerships based on mutual benefit and shared expertise. The change wasn't universal or without resistance, but it was noticeable enough to attract attention from business leaders and politicians throughout the state. As their cooperative continued to grow and prosper, both Jake and Thomas began to realize that their original handshake agreement had created something far more valuable than either man had initially understood. The $1,500 each had received from Hartwell's purchase was insignificant compared to the ongoing profits generated by their mining operation, but, more importantly, their partnership had demonstrated that trust and honor could be the foundation for business success even in the harsh competitive environment of the frontier. The true measure of what Jake and Thomas had achieved became clear when other mining communities began sending representatives to Cripple Creek to study their cooperative model. The techniques they had developed for sharing resources and managing diverse partnerships were being adopted in mining camps throughout Colorado and neighboring states. What had begun as a simple agreement between two friends was becoming a template for economic cooperation that transcended traditional social boundaries. Years later, when journalists and historians would write about the transformation of mining communities in the American West, they would point to the partnership between Jake Morrison and Thomas Chen as a crucial turning point. Their willingness to honor their word to each other, even when doing so required personal sacrifice, had created ripple effects that changed the lives of hundreds of families and challenged assumptions about what kinds of relationships were possible on the frontier. The gold that Jake's honor had cost him in the immediate sense, the additional money he might have received if Thomas had accepted Hartwell's original offer individually, proved to be insignificant compared to the wealth that their partnership generated over time. But the real treasure wasn't measured in dollars extracted from the Colorado mountainsides. It was found in the relationships they had built, the barriers they had broken down, and the example they had set for others who believed that a person's character mattered more than their race or their country of origin. When Thomas finally did return to China for a visit several years later, he traveled not as a desperate immigrant seeking economic survival, but as a successful businessman whose American ventures had created opportunities for dozens of families in both countries. Jake, who had started as a wandering cowboy with no permanent home, found himself rooted in Colorado as the leader of one of the most innovative mining cooperatives in the American West. The friendship that had begun with a simple act of kindness outside a general store had evolved into a partnership that demonstrated the transformative power of honor, trust, and mutual respect. In choosing to value their word over immediate financial gain, Jake and Thomas had discovered that some forms of wealth could only be earned through the willingness to sacrifice gold for something far more precious, the knowledge that they had remained true to their principles and to each other, regardless of the cost.